Is it the end of US and Russian arms control? Washington's pulled out of their Cold War-era nuclear treaty, blaming Moscow for failing to comply and raising fears of a new nuclear arms race. So what chance of a new agreement? Maybe even with some new players? This is Inside Story. Hello everyone, I'm Kamal Santamaria. Welcome to Inside Story. For 32 years, it was the treaty that kept a lid on the nuclear ambitions of what were then the world's two superpowers. And now, overnight, it's gone. The United States has pulled out of its landmark arms control deal with Russia, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, increasing fears that there might be some sort of new arms race between the two nuclear powers. Now, the US says Russia didn't stick to its side of the bargain and instead built missiles banned under the agreement. Moscow denies that and says Washington made a serious mistake pulling out of the deal. Just for a bit of background, the treaty, known as the INF, was signed between the US and what was then the Soviet Union in 1987. It banned all short and medium-range missiles, both nuclear and non-nuclear, with the exception of weapons launched from the sea. Within 4 years, nearly 2,700 missiles were destroyed, and both countries were allowed to inspect each other's installations. But Washington's withdrawal means there is now only one arms control agreement left between the US and Russia. That is the New START Treaty, which limits long-range nuclear weapons in both countries and is considered the most important agreement reached during the Cold War. But the US National Security Advisor John Bolton already says New START won't be extended beyond its deadline of February 2021. So we're going to discuss in a moment what will happen next with our panel. But first, this report from our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett.
It's a treaty U.S. President Donald Trump has repeatedly accused Russia of violating.
Russia has not adhered to the agreement. This should have been done years ago.
The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty was signed in 1987 by then U.S. President Ronald Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. For 31 years, it's banned both sides from deploying medium-range land-based missiles, halting the arms race between the two superpowers. But Washington and Moscow clashed for years over Russia's development and deployment of a cruise missile system the United States and its allies say was prohibited under the Cold War Pact. In February, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced that if Russia did not begin to comply with the agreement, the U.S. would withdraw on August 2nd.
Russia has jeopardized the United States' security interest, and we can no longer be restricted by the treaty while Russia shamelessly violates it.
That announcement prompted Russian President Vladimir Putin to warn the United States against deploying new missiles in Europe while showcasing next-generation Russian weaponry.
I'd like to tell you about the Zircon hypersonic missile, which can travel at about 9 times the speed of sound, has a range of more than 1,000 kilometers.
For months, NATO leaders urged Russia to comply with the deal to prevent its collapse.
The U.S. concerns and NATO concerns about the new Russian missiles have been raised with Russia over several years.
But last-minute pleas to keep that deal intact failed. In July, Putin signed a law suspending Russia's participation in the agreement. Now hopes are diminishing for preserving the last remaining arms pact between the United States and Russia, the New START Treaty, signed in 2010 and set to expire in 2021. Trump's National Security Advisor John Bolton has called the treaty flawed.
I fear that without INF and with the attitude of Mr. Bolton, with the lack of interest and focus of President Trump, we end up without a New START treaty as well. We go into a nuclear arms race like we saw in the 1960s, only more expensive and more dangerous.
The Pentagon has announced it will begin flight tests of new intermediate-range ballistic missiles and cruise missiles by the end of this year. And it's requested funding to develop new missile systems that previously would have been prohibited under the INF treaty. Kimberly Halkett, Al Jazeera, the White House.
All right, so here's our panel of experts for today. We're starting in Vienna with Tarek Graf, who is an expert on nuclear disarmament, also the former head of verification and security policy at the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. In Moscow, Glenn Deason, professor of international relations at the highest school of economics in Moscow. He also wrote the book The Decay of Western Civilization and Resurgence of Russia. And finally, in Washington, D.C., David DeRoche. He is a professor and senior military fellow at the National Defense University, also the former NATO operations director at the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Gentlemen, welcome to all of you, all supremely qualified to talk about this topic. I wonder if I could start with a general question, and I'll get a short answer from each of you. And this is really to clear things up about the violation of the treaty. Was it violated? Because you've got both sides saying, no, we didn't do it, it was them. So, Tarek Graf, first of all, in your view, was the treaty violated? Was it warranted that the US would pull out of it?
Well, it's not entirely clear because the US Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coats, said that the Russians have tested this missile, the 9M729, from a fixed launcher in a range in excess of 500 kilometers and from a mobile launcher with a range less than 500 kilometers. And taken together, the US deems this to be a violation. The Russians, on the other hand, say that the 9M729 cruise missile has a range of only 480 kilometers. So neither side has really followed up on this to have a technical solution. Both have made political points.
Glenn Deason in Moscow, do you agree that there's some grey area going on here?
There's definitely some grey areas, which is why it's a bit uncertain if Russia has been in violation. But the Russian position is that it's as you mentioned, it's the other side, the United States, that has been in violation, because Russia very much links the INF Treaty with the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the ABM Treaty, which the United States withdrew from in 2002, because now with NATO building up its Aegis missile defense system, effectively the missiles can be deployed now in Poland and Romania has the potential to take an offensive posture and be used in a strike against Russia. So these deployments towards Romania and Poland are seen to be in direct violation of the INF Treaty, and Russia therefore sees itself as simply responding by developing its own capabilities in response. Okay, and David DeRoche in Washington, any further clarity from you, or do you agree with our other two guests?
Well, no. Well, look, if you're arguing over a projected 20-kilometer range on a missile, that's a pretty bad indication of good faith. And equating the missile defense system with an offensive system is really apples and oranges. So what we're dealing here with is pettifoggery. The Russians have been unhappy with the treaty. You know, Putin in 2007 said he was unhappy with the treaty because it didn't address Chinese things. And there's been a lot of bad faith here, but I think the administration's been pretty deliberate and counter what you said at the start, that this was overnight. I mean, the administration gave 6 months notice that change had to happen. So this has been a deliberative thing, and it's not the United States charging into it alone. Okay. Does some of it also, I'll stay with you, David, does some of it also come down to the sort of quote-unquote Trump doctrine of withdrawal, you know, withdrawing from pacts and basically saying, well, America should be able to do what it wants to do? I mean, that's sort of the vibe you get from John Bolton as well. Well, you know, you can dislike John Bolton, you can dislike Donald Trump and still admit they can be right from time to time. I think, if anything, the visceral dislike that most overseas have for Trump and Bolton, and even Mike Pompeo, smears what is actually a pretty clear-cut issue that the administration was raising. You know, the United States was raising this even under Barack Obama. It's just that they're at a point now where they've said this is just unsustainable because of the fielding of the 9M729. So, Glenn, in Moscow, you know, David's raised some good points there, not least of all the fact that, and as I said, it did happen overnight, and the fact that the treaty was gone, but this had been flagged up for a while. There were, I would presume, opportunities to try to salvage it, and it didn't happen. Why couldn't it be salvaged? Well, I think that the whole idea of blaming Russia for it, it's a bit dishonest, because even the American side has, to a certain extent, been very specific as well, that they're worried about China. And on that area,
I'm inclined to be a bit empathetic towards the American position because this is arms treaty belonging to a different time. Again, from 1987. It's a treaty between the United States and the Soviet Union at a time when there was a bipolar distribution of power and very different technologies. Now, this treaty does not constrain China. And given the changes we have now in the international system, that creates a lot of problems. So from the American perspective, you have Russia reduced in power, and they no longer want to feel obliged to live up to former arms control treaties with the Russians. Meanwhile, China is rising, and the Americans don't really have the ability to respond because they're constrained with this treaty which they have with the Russians. So I think that this, blaming the Russians is, it's very dishonest because, again, this idea that the missile defense component have no offensive posture, there's been plenty of studies of this in best studies probably from Professor Postol at MIT, who's very much recognized as a leading academic in this area. So, and they all recognize the same thing, that this missile defense component are in violation of the INF Treaty, which does warrant a Russian response. But if it's really just about the Chinese issue, then it should probably have a different response from the Americans, because the Russians have some similar concerns. But what you'll see now is effectively this will push the Russians militarily closer and closer with China, as they need the Chinese to defend their Pacific fleet, as the Americans are developing these new missile capabilities.
Glenn, as you have mentioned the Chinese, and in fact, I think all three of you have mentioned the Chinese. Let's just have a quick listen to this. This is a spokesperson from the Chinese Ministry for Foreign Affairs.
China deeply regrets and firmly opposes the U.S. decision to neglect the opposition from the international community and withdraw from the INF Treaty. The withdrawal is another negative move by the U.S. to pursue unilateralism in disregard of its international commitments, aiming to shake off the bindings by itself and seek unilateral military and strategic advantages. If the U.S. resumes the development and deployment of intermediate-range nuclear forces, it will seriously affect global strategic balance and stability.
Tarek, Ralph and Vienna, let me come to you. Can you maybe explain to viewers who aren't so up on the nuclear world why China would be reacting like that, and also just build on the idea that, China could even be considered a part of this in the future?
Well, I think the Chinese card is a little bit of a red herring, because even in 1987, the Chinese did have some shorter and intermediate range systems that did not concern the two countries at that time. So the US and Russia do not need to match China weapon for weapon. They can deter China given their strategic capabilities. But at the moment, China does not really have any incentive to join this, any new agreement, because if they were to join a new strategic agreement, they would need to build up. And nobody wants the Chinese to build up any further weapons than they already have. And they have no incentive to put their medium-range missiles on the table. I also wanted to complete the discussion that on the Russian side, the allegation is that the Mark 41 Aegis launcher, which is land-based in Romania and in Poland, can be used to launch Tomahawk ground-launched cruise missiles, and that is an issue of concern for the Russians, as well as the target missile for the anti-ballistic missile testing system, which is called Hera. And the Russians also complain that heavy combat drones like the Predator also violate the INF Treaty. I also wanted to pick up on another point, that under the Trump administration, the U.S. is slowly winding back the clock on nuclear arms control. They've come up now with a new initiative called Creating the Environment for Nuclear Disarmament. In actuality, one could call it Creating the Environment for No Nuclear Disarmament, because under the Nuclear Posture Review, the U.S. is moving towards low-yield nuclear weapons, and in their nuclear guidance that came out in June, the U.S. is openly calling for the use of low-yield and small nuclear weapons to restore strategic stability in a conflict. And for its part, the Russians have this concept of escalate to de-escalate. So if they were to have a conflict with NATO, they would use nuclear weapons early as well to prevent a larger war. So on both sides, there is a movement towards a nuclear warfighting doctrine. And also, I think your Russian colleague mentioned the development of hypersonic weapons, which again is even more destabilizing, because they would be traveling at somewhere around 5 kilometers per second. and therefore not be defended against any anti-ballistic missile system. And this destabilizes the offense-defense balance between the Russians and the Americans.
Okay, so you've led us nicely into the next part of the conversation, which was going to be about what happens next. And the idea, and it's a very sort of catchy phrase which gets used, but this idea of a quote-unquote new nuclear arms race. Let's go to David DeRoche in Washington about that. Let's not say that there's, hundreds and thousands of new nukes just around the corner, but doesn't the end of this treaty sort of give a bit of a green light to increase things?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, look, the United States and NATO is behind the game on this. I mean, even at the height of the Cold War, we're only talking about a couple hundred launchers, Pershing and ground-launched cruise missiles that were deployed during the Cold War. And it's important to note that they were only employed in Europe, not in Asia against the Chinese threat. So this is very much a European issue, even though both sides were unhappy with the fact that it left China unconstrained. The second thing is the American presence in this and the NATO presence in this is going to be a measured one. We haven't been building new weapons, missiles of this sort. We've been building other things that might be characterized as Tariq notes, Predator and stuff like that. But those are really, it's very uneconomical for us to try to convert, an Aegis missile launcher into an offensive system. It's just not cost practical. It'd be easier for us to try to revive like the old Pershing line. So I think what we'd see is just enough to deter and not another step forward.
Okay, let me counter that for a second. It is expensive because quickly I want to read you this. It's from ICANN, which you'll know is the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. Reading on their website today, they believe the US is projected to spend $1.2 trillion in the coming 30 years to maintain and modernize its existing arsenal. That's a lot of money.
Well, I dispute the number, I dispute the premise, and I dispute the source. But when we look at modernizing our arsenal, what's important to know is that generally that includes the entire domestic nuclear industry, and usually what we're doing is repurposing existing warheads rather than building new ones. In many instances, the American warheads being used are ones that were originally built in the 1960s and have been updated. So I'm not quite sure how expensive that would be and what extent it would. And I'm also, I'm sure that ICANN report, which I haven't seen, includes also the strategic nuclear deterrence, which is, submarines, land-based, the big things that we're not really discussing here. So I think that's a big bit of red herring. It's actually more of a red whale.
Okay, well, let's see what Glenn thinks about this in Moscow. Is ICANN and the groups of its ilk, are they overstating the facts here? I mean, again, from that same ICANN report, they said, quote, a new nuclear arms race is right around the corner. What do you reckon?
I think definitely that relations will get much worse, and it does probably put everything in place for another arms race. However, again, the technologies have changed as well. It's not just the nuclear weapons, which is why it's difficult now to have an arms treaty, because there's also new precision weapons which are conventional, and furthermore, like Russia it's not the Soviet Union anymore. It can't really follow an arms race all the way with the United States, but instead you have other options using different technologies. So you mentioned the hypersonic missiles. Those would be, it's destabilizing, but it's a way of balancing out America's effort to try to establish this nuclear or military hegemony. You also have this new technologies coming forward, so underwater, nuclear submarine drones, and in different efforts in order to balance off this new drive towards maintaining this American military hegemony. But again, I think Russia it has no interest in starting this, so I think you will see mostly tit for tat. So if the Americans put some weapons out, the Russians will respond. Now it's assumed that the Americans will first prioritize arming or placing a lot of these weapons in Asia to counter China. And as I mentioned, this creates a lot of problems for the Pacific Fleet of Russia. So it will need to upgrade a lot of its capabilities to defend its second strike capabilities primarily, but also it's a huge incentive to cooperate more with China, because this American economic coercion against Russia and China in the last few years have pushed these two countries together economically. And now that this conflict is becoming more militarized, I think you will see Russia and China cooperating more and more militarily to counter this American effort to build up its military forces, especially in the Pacific.
Tarek Graf in Vienna, let me bring you back in because I think you're well placed to maybe answer my next question, and I think you've got something else you want to say. But I did want to ask just about Europe itself, because we're talking all about Russia and the United States here. Stuck in the middle of all this, ostensibly, is Europe. And are those European countries right to be as concerned as they seem to be?
So this $1 trillion modernization is not new. This actually came up under the Obama administration soon after he made his famous speech in Prague in 2009, calling for a nuclear weapon-free world, because the U.S. says it needs to reinvest in its ballistic missile submarines, in its land-based ICBMs, and its strategic bombers. The Russians already are building a new generation of ballistic missile submarines. They're also investing in new land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, and also investing in their air force. So this modernization is going on both sides, so we really shouldn't necessarily single out the U.S. here. With regard to Europe, they are in a very tight bind already. They are in disarray over Brexit. They are in disarray over the preservation of the Iran deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And then loaded on top of that is this controversy now over the INF Treaty and its future. It would be very controversial in Europe were the U.S. to decide to bring back nuclear-armed cruise missiles or medium-range missiles in Europe, and it will further divide Europe between the old members of the European Union and the new members. So the new members, like the Czech Republic, Poland, and Romania, are closer to the U.S. in wanting greater military investments to counter what they perceive as the Russian threat, whereas the older members, such as Germany, the Netherlands, and some others, favor more an arms control approach. So as I mentioned, this new initiative of the U.S. called Creating the Environment for Nuclear Disarmament, they held a meeting in Washington on the 2nd and 3rd of July, where nearly 42 countries came, and a number of European countries were present there as well. They're all trying to see if they can moderate the two sides, but at the moment it seems very difficult. And I think it's not President Trump that's the problem. He has given interviews where he has expressed skepticism about nuclear weapons. It's more his national security advisor and to a certain extent his state secretary that are behind this new assertiveness and muscularity in U.S. defense and foreign policy.
Gentlemen, we're just starting to run down the clock now. One final thought. I'm just thinking, we are in August 2019 at the moment. Excuse me. And as I mentioned before, February 2021 is when the last remaining treaty, New START, expires. And John Bolton's already said we're not renewing that either. David in Washington, if I start with you, do we need to keep that in the back of our minds? The fact that that very last piece of the puzzle could yet fall, in fact, probably will fall in a couple of years?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, the fact that you've had the withdrawal from the INF, which has always been a European-centric thing, as a matter of fact, the impetus for it was Helmut Schmidt when he was a chancellor, that may be seen as enough to address this issue, and people might have a wait and see. And the other thing is, there's an election between now and then. By February of 2021, John Bolton could be a private citizen. His opinion could be worth about as much as mine. So, I wouldn't pin too much on that. It's worth watching, but it's not worth watching like, say, a Predator drone watches an area of interest.
Okay, quick final thought from you then,
This is probably going to be where it plays out.
Well, I think it's going to be very hard to replace it with something else, simply given the new distribution of power, as China will not want to commit to anything. You have different technologies, which makes it difficult because you have to take into account conventional weapons as well. And lastly, I think there's just a lack of empathy on all sides. There's very little recognition for the security concerns of the adversary. That's both the case in Moscow and in Washington. And as you see in the anti-Russian hysteria that has flushed over the West over the last few years, it's definitely there's no mood there really to appreciate the mutual concerns. So I'm very pessimistic on this issue, though.
Glenn Deason in Moscow, I thank you very much. Also David DeRoche in Washington, D.C. and Tarek Graf joining us from Vienna. And of course, thank you as well for watching. Plenty more for you online. This show and all our previous ones are at aljazeera.com on demand, Inside Story in the shows section. We're also at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. We're on Twitter at AJ Inside Story, and I'm at Kamal AJE if you want to get in touch with me. From the whole Inside Story team, thanks for joining us. We'll see you again soon.